Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One GPU analysis. So, we've already had part 1 where we've delved heavily into some of the basics of the GPU, as well as the memory and other bits and pieces. In this one, we're going to be focused a lot on the API and a few other key components of the GPU. There's still a hell of a lot more to go, trust me on that. So, let's first of all, before we even get into the PlayStation 4 specific features, I want to give you guys an overview of the API situation. So the API on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One has evolved over time. We know this, we know that of course originally the systems were very generic PC-like devices, and of course over the course of weeks, months and even years they tinkered, they chipped away at what doesn't work, and this has vastly improved the performance of the machine, and more to the point, they've tailored the hardware to better suit the needs of a console. Microsoft just recently mentioned, along with the GPU clock speed increase, of course, from 800 to 853 megahertz, that another thing they've done is make significant changes to the driver and the API as a whole. One of the big examples of this is they said that they started with basically DirectX 11. It was 11.2 if you want me to be technical. And they pretty much started to remove anything that wasn't Xbox One related code. This has numerous benefits. For one, it reduces the memory footprint as well as resources such as CPU resources and whatever else in the system. Because after all, if it's something is not needed, it is, well, useless, and therefore might as well be removed. Remember, originally DirectX 11 was built for PCs, and PCs, well, you know the story. They are an open platform. In other words, you can put an AMD, you can put an NVIDIA card in there, you could have an integrated card, you can have various sound cards, and so forth. Therefore, DirectX needs to be a hell of a lot larger. And then, of course, they started to do other things, such as tweak it, and put in Xbox-specific instructions. They didn't exactly go into super detail of what those are. However, some of them are most likely to do with cloud computing, as well as some specific APU changes, changes for perhaps ESRAM, and so on and so forth as well. Now, the PlayStation 4, from what we understand from leaks and whatever else, can be actually debugged very similar to that of a PC game. So you can use tools such as C and C++, which of course are programming languages, and they are front ends, and they can be well coded as required, and there's actually some really good debugging tools available. Those allow developers to better see what performance they're getting in certain games. They'd be able to see what performance, for example, a specific task is requiring of the GPU. For example, let's say they can see how much memory the textures are taking, or they can see how much time, say, particle effects are taking, or whatever they want to do. This is really important for, well, good performance, because they may say that, oh, okay, we need to better improve or optimize a certain bit of code, or maybe there's a bug in a certain piece of code and there's a huge memory leak. Whatever it is. And as we understand, this uses Visual Studio 210 and 2012, and this allows them to do quite a lot of stuff. Now, we're going to go into Microsoft's API in just a moment, more in depth, but Sony don't actually use DirectX. They actually instead use their own versions. They actually use two specific APIs. Now, the graphics APIs are pretty much brand spanking new. They've written them from the ground up specifically for the PlayStation 4 hardware. This means that a lot of the baggage code, a lot of the useless code, a lot of the crap that you would normally associate with graphics libraries that have passed on to many generations, that's no longer there. It's a clean slate, effectively. As an aside, it's worth noting that we know from what John Carmack has said, and it makes a lot of sense. A lot of game engines now comprise of a couple of millions, and we're not kidding here, a couple of million of lines of code. It doesn't make sense for a developer to say, okay, well, you know what, this has been pretty sweet, this engine, it's worked for us pretty well up until now. Anyway, shift delete, and we can start all over again. No, that's not what they're going to be doing, and what they're most likely going to do is it's going to be transitory. In other words, they're going to slowly tweak things, especially as the PS4 and Xbox One take over as the prevalent systems, and basically force the Xbox 360 and PS3 into the more back-place market. Now, as I said earlier, there are two specific APIs. The first is what is known as GNM. I'll repeat that one more time. Golf November Mother. Now, this API gives you a hell of a lot of control over the GPU, and it does mean that there's going to be a lot of work, but it's also a lot of flexibility as well. You can think of it as a very low-level API, and because of this, it's actually a really big strength for Sony, because it means that you can actually get better performance out of the GPU, because you're basically able to access and talk to its features directly. And this is a really big thing. There is no interpretation of a code here. It's quite literally a simple fact of, I need you to do X, and it's a direct command. Therefore, you can talk directly to the GPU, tell it what you need to do, and this is going to be really important for things like compute. Remember that Sony themselves have specifically stated that they don't think that compute is going to be this thing that happens over, a 2-month period after the system's released, to a 6-month period. It's most likely going to grow over time, and we're going to go more into compute later on, because that's a really big subject as well. I don't want to start derailing my own videos. So fine-grained control is going to be a really important factor just for that reason alone. And so in my personal opinion, low-level API control is pretty damn important. Now, it does have a few drawbacks, because computing isn't like one of those things where there's just always a positive. For example, if you overclock your processor, sure, you're getting free performance, but you're also producing more heat, and you're also costing yourself more money because you're, needing more electricity to run it. And so there's always a trade-off. In this case, the trade-off is quite simple. It requires a lot more time and a lot more knowledge to be able to know what you're doing and to be able to actually get on and code it. The other benefit of this, and once again there is always benefits, is that it also provides a hit on the CPU, by which I mean that it actually takes away some CPU performance. And while obviously we are discussing the GPU primarily in this video, it's worth noting that overall system performance cannot be damned. You cannot simply assume one is an insular thing. Sony have done a lot of stuff to improve the performance of this this issue, but it's still there. And so obviously, once again, the utilization of the low level does mean that you're freeing up CPU resources, because you're not really requiring the higher level API. Now, the higher level API, as it turns out, is known as GNMX, or Golf November Mother X-Ray. And funnily enough, it's actually really similar to DirectX 11. So if you're very familiar with DX11 or coding, and then you go straight into this, then you're going to feel, I wouldn't exactly say completely and utterly at home, because obviously there's going to be some changes here and there. But in terms of overall structure, it's very similar. That's really good news for if you're just starting out with development, because you can just say, oh, okay, I understand this, and then you can start customizing it as necessary, and you can start writing your own bits and pieces, your own bits of C++ or whatever you're actually coding in, and Bob's your uncle. This is really good for just setting up a game initially, and then you can say, okay, well, I don't like the frame rate of this, maybe I should start using lower level APIs for certain things. The other benefit, as I've stated earlier, is you don't really require so much of a CPU here. As I said, Sony have done some fixing of this, but even so, once again, it's an issue of, if it's not really a game that requires a hell of a lot of GPU complexity, or a lot of GPU/CPU time anyway, it doesn't really matter, I suppose, you can argue, because well, you've got the resources to spare, so you might be better just simply use the higher level, unless of course you want to practice for when you actually really do need it. But generally speaking, if you just need to get on with things, I suppose you could just stay at the higher level and say, okay, well, we can just skim forward. Now, this is one of the reasons that I've actually said that the PC is the common link between Xbox One and PlayStation 4 development, because it's very easy to port between the two. So let's talk about DirectX 11. Now, because of the rather... I'm going to go and use the word intricate setup of the Xbox One's operating systems. Now, we know that each system has a partition of memory available that, depending on the operating system. In the case of the Xbox One, it's about 5 gigs is available for games, which is roughly the same as the PlayStation 4. As it turns out, however, as far as what we understand it, maybe because we do know that Microsoft are doing some improvements to the drivers and so on, so it would be nice, but as far as we understand it from right now, there is no low-level access, to the hardware. This is another issue that I was dealing with in the very first video when I was saying about you can't just directly compare performance, because this may or may not become a big thing over time. Personally, I think that early on, the early games, the first couple of generation of games, for example, especially when you consider that right now we're on this transitionary stage of games that are still on, the Xbox 360 and the PS3, it's not really a big deal. I mean, those engines are basically pushed to their limits anyway, simply because. But the games will eventually start to become more convoluted, more complicated, and more telling on the consoles, because they're going to start moving away. John Carmack, for example, has stated that, look, when you start to run games in 60 frames per second at 1080p, it takes significant amounts of resources compared to 720p at 30 frames per second. And that's obvious, right? I mean, 60 frames per second versus 30, it basically, the GPU is having to render twice the amount of frames. And that's quite significant when you start looking at how that affects LOD, also known as level of detail. Level of detail, of course, being how detailed, say, textures are, or how much polygons you can fit in a polygon model, for example, of a soldier or a character on the screen. And it also starts to impact other things such as particle effects and physics and goodness knows what else, because all of those need to be calculated on the fly and simultaneously. Sorry, I just caught the mic there. Apologies. And so you can imagine just how big of a difference it's not going to really make at the start, but in a year's time, 2-3 years' time, however, I think we're going to start to really see this become a thing. And APIs themselves they're crucial, actually, is what it comes down to, for performance. I've used the examples many times over, but PCs are the kings of this, because driver updates can become huge on PCs. Now, the problem with PCs, and one of the issues with PCs, is that Microsoft DirectX or OpenGL, it doesn't really matter which one in this case, but it needs to be basically written, a game needs to be written on the lowest common denominator. In other words, it needs to be able to run over multiple things, and that's why you have huge difficulty getting premium performance out of a PC. That's one of the reasons that you can have a PC that has significantly more memory, a better GPU, and a better CPU, and it can actually lose or have difficulties with a PC, say a lower spec console. However, of course, PCs just win out of pure brutality, sheer might, because their hardware is a lot better, and overall, of course, that does usually prevail in not too long a time, maybe a couple of years. PCs easily outstrip consoles, and of course, in the case of modern day PCs, we've already got graphics cards that are significantly faster to the PS4 and Xbox One's GPUs, but as we're saying in this, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's all there is to it. Now, I did say that Microsoft have made large strides to improving the DirectX 11 API that is, of course, well, the Xbox One's reliant upon. But even so, this is going to be something it's still going to be there, really. And as John Carmack was saying at the QuakeCon interview, no one right now is just going to throw away millions of lines of code, but there is certainly going to be some practices that are going to become more and more prevalent. So this low-level access is going to be quite a big thing, I think, in the long term, and I think it's going to make things a lot easier. And that's really the key that I think Sony have gone with, is programmability and ease. Now, once again, this doesn't necessarily mean that the Xbox One is going to do badly. It doesn't mean that the games are going to become significantly worse looking, especially early on. However, we're going to have to see in 4 or 5 years' time just what this really means, especially as the consoles age and, well, developers are scrambling to get every last bit of performance out of it. Once again, just to use an example, The Last of Us on the PlayStation 3 is a case of, look, you can see that the developers, Naughty Dogs in this case, have done pretty much everything that they can. They've stretched the PS3 to the limit. It's having to do everything from streaming textures, from sources, to using the cell processors to help with the graphics, and a lot more besides. And all of this is being done at basically the very high point of the PS3. It's basically its final fanfare to show, okay, well, this is really what the system can do. However, if you were to look at earlier games, or even titles like, say, God of War, one of the things that, say, Santa Monica did on God of War is that they used basically a variable frame rate. And one of the reasons behind doing this is they said, you know what, we realized that it's not feasible to have animation or a cutscene running at, say, 40 frames per second when we can have a lot more detail in it. Or let's say it's just an open room with nothing going on. We can raise the detail up and just lower the frame rate. That's fine. But when there's lots of action, you can't have the thing dipping to like 25 frames per second or less, because then you're going to start dropping frames all over the shop, and that's just crap. That does not make for smooth combat. And therefore, as an artist, as the artists had to move forward, they had to say, okay, well, this is what we need in this is what we need in this, and, you know, they had to make those decisions on the fly, and they worked with the programmers, the artists, and the game designers, and everyone came to a happy medium, and they figured that this is the best way to go. My point, obviously, is that this is another thing that developers are going to have to do on the PS4 and the Xbox One. They're going to evolve their techniques, and I think, as I've spoken about, you've got the ESRAM issue on the Xbox One, as well as the low-level access that the PS4 grants you. And I think those two things alone are going to make things very, very interesting for Xbox One developers. Because one of the things that I personally would imagine is for cross-platform games, let's say you're developing a game, whatever that game may be, and you're developing it for the PC, the PS4, and Xbox One. Let's ignore the PC. Let's just say that that's a given and it works, right? And therefore, you've got to port the game to the PS4 and Xbox One. The problem is that the PS4 isn't necessarily the better platform in huge quotations. It could just be the easier platform because you've got this amount of power. in terms of the ESRAM and the Xbox One, that's going to be quite interesting, just how developers are going to have to squeeze the data down and manage to make it fit in. I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing lower resolution textures and stuff in its place, or maybe lower resolution games, maybe sub 1080p and then upscaled, but we're going to go into that later in much more depth. We know that, as I've said earlier, in regards to the ROPs, that's not really going to play much of a crucial role. I don't really think at the start anyway. Maybe when it comes to, say, certain levels of free AA, anti-aliasing, of course, which helps to smooth out the jaggies. You guys know what those are, I'm assuming. If not, I'll just quickly give a little bit of an explanation. Those are basically if you say, for example, see a corner of an object, or say a vase or whatever, and you notice it's got those kind of rough edges, it doesn't look quite smooth, especially at certain angles. It's a real bugger at certain angles. Then you'll notice that if you start applying certain levels of AA, whether it's MSAA or TSAA or whatever, you start applying that AA, well, the anti-aliasing starts to pretty much do exactly what it was expected to do given the name. It starts to reduce the jaggies, smooth them out, and that does have some inherent drawbacks, primarily performance, because it of course takes processing time, memory, bandwidth to a degree as well, so that can be a bit of an issue. But ROPs as well, because a lot of this is done after it's basically rendered the scene. It can't, you can't apply anti-aliasing to nothing. You can't just apply it to like a blank slate. So basically after the scene's pretty much been finished, not 100% finished, because obviously the anti-aliasing and other bits and pieces need to be applied, but still. So I think that's still going to be there. So I guess the question is just how much of a difference all this stuff so far is going to make. Well, ROPs, it's hard to say. I think it depends on the direction the developers are going to go. I think that the ESRAM is going to definitely make quite a bit of difference, and I think overall all the porting processes are definitely going to become a lot easier on the PS4, simply because of the unified memory. As a slight aside, Mark Cerny himself originally said that they did originally have the option to go with a amount of ESRAM, or basically the buffer, as well as the GDDR5 memory. And doing so would have meant that they had, I don't remember what the exact figure was, but I know it was over 200 gigabytes per second in bandwidth. But they decided, you know what, that's not worth it. They decided to go with the unified large chunk of memory because it was easier for developers, and that's a really, really, really important key. So the PS4 definitely has a large advantage. It has basically double the amount of ROPs, as I said, 32 compared to 16, and 64 Z stencil ROPs versus 128, so that's pretty significant as well. So what's left to talk about? Well, a lot actually. Still to talk about is compute functionality, and we're going to go into that as well. We're going to be speaking a lot about memory buses and how they're going to impact things as well, and then we're going to round things up and finish things off as well, because, well, we've got to do that. So stick with me on yet another part. Now I'm hoping the fact that I'm actually splitting these into parts makes it easy for people. What my basic hope is that because you guys will be able to read the title, you'll be able to see everything, you'll be able to get a drink and be able to digest things, and more to the point, from my perspective, it allows me to much better explain certain points and goes off on slight tangents and explain things a hell of a lot better than what I would, because what I had noticed in previous videos, this is obviously addressing regular viewers, but for regular viewers, I'd noticed that sometimes I was getting messages that they weren't exactly sure about a specific point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split my videos up now, for the most part. I'm not going to, do it for like 20-minute videos or whatever, because that's just crap. But certainly for like videos that I know are going to be really lengthy, like 50-minute videos, whatever, then I'm going to split them up, and they'll probably end up actually being for you guys longer, because I'll probably make them like significantly lengthier because I can actually explain things better, and I don't want to start putting up like an hour and 10-minute videos, because I'll be honest, for me personally to record that amount, I'm just going to pause the video and and then come back to it, because my recording time is already like 3 hours generally for a lot of these videos. I'm no word of a lie, I have a lot of tabs open. My browser right now will probably make you OCD people cry inside because I have so many tabs open. With various graphics card specifications and goodness knows what else, and so it's not really feasible for me to record like an hour and a half thing or like an hour and 10-minute thing in one go, because mentally I'd forget where I was going with it and have to take breaks and stuff as well, of course. So I think it's better for me in terms of quality to split things up. However, once again, just to reiterate, as I said in the previous part, I would like to hear your feedback on this. This was actually a request by a few viewers that I start splitting videos up like this, and I personally think it makes some sense, is what it comes down to, which is why I'm doing it. But if you guys don't agree, once again, you can feel free to, point it out to me. I also think it's really beneficial for people who want information on a specific part of a video, rather than me saying, or rather than them trying to find a huge, trying to go through a huge long ass video just to find like a couple of minutes. If I can put the title much better and be like, yeah, this video is about X, Y, and Z, and this video is about Y and B in the same type of subject, and I think it makes it a little bit easier for everyone. But once again, I'm more than open to feedback on this new format, and I look forward to hearing your opinions. Anyway, that's just about it for now. The next videos will be released tomorrow, because I've been recording for an ungodly amount of time right now and I need a mental break. So hopefully you've enjoyed this particular couple of parts of the video. Don't worry guys, this is not going to be like one of those things where I'm going to be doing like 10-minute parts or anything like that, because that's just awful. I will be keeping the videos like 25 minutes plus still, but I'm just doing it mostly for searchability and for better content for everyone. Just so I can mentally be able to segment stuff and be able to research things better and explain things better as well, without getting into videos that are like an hour long, because I don't think anyone's going to really be able to focus and listen to all that. But once again, I look forward to your feedback on this new format and let me know. So you can go facebook.com, that's facebook.com/redgamingtech, and you can let me know directly. Anyway, that's just about it for this particular video. I will see you soon, hopefully. Take care, and bye for now.